He glared at me with that "why didn't you say so earlier" look that parents always give the one kid who forgot to go. I had to stall him. We could not get on the interstate with 3 people asleep and 1, awake and terrified, sitting in the back seat. He pulled in at the first gas station we came to. It had a convenience store, and that gave me an idea. This is kind of embarrassing," I said. He stared at me in the rearview mirror, with his eyes saying, "What now?" Girl stuff? That time of the...
Oh, jeez. What do you want me to do about it?
I glanced over at Ollie, whose eyelids were already at half-mast. "I'll have to go inside and buy some..."
Fine. Don't give me no details.
He shut off the engine and got out, fishing a few dollars out of his pocket. If I'd hoped that he would let me go inside alone, I was soon disappointed. He walked right along with me. He wasn't quite as paranoid as String, but he wasn't taking any chances on their $1 million baby getting away. I went to the right aisle and chose the brightest pink package they had. Mole averted his eyes as he paid, and I made a show of opening the box and heading toward the women's restroom. He was yawning as I went inside. I stalled as long as I feasibly could, and then peeked outside. He'd given up standing by the restroom door and was waiting near the registers. He yawned again, hugely, but stuck right with me as I walked toward the car, my bright pink package in my hands. "All better," I announced. We settled into our seats, and I was pleased to see that Ollie was also completely out of it now. "Oh, look, there's an ice cream place. I'd really love an ice cream." I have no idea why he didn't simply turn around and belt me. He had to either know that I was stalling or consider me the biggest pain in the ass in the world. When he steered toward the ice cream stand, I could only attribute his compliance to the hazy feeling he must be getting from those pills. Doesn't look like they have a drive-thru. I'll just order at the window." He didn't protest, and he didn't leave his seat. I hopped out and walked up to the tiny order window. A teenage girl popped her gum, and she asked what I wanted. To give her a lesson in proper customer service was what I really wanted, but there was no time for that. I glanced over at Mole. His eyes were on me. Even if I thought I had a prayer of convincing this dim-wit girl to call the police without giving away the reason, I knew Mole was still being far too careful. I ordered 2 hot fudge sundaes. "Here, I got you one too." I gave it my best perky voice as I handed one to him through the open window. "Looks like the other guys will miss out." Mole seemed surprised. Maybe no woman had ever bought him ice cream before. Maybe it was just the way his eyes looked when he was struggling really hard to keep them open. He took a spoonful of the ice cream, then set the cup on the console as he backed out of his parking spot and turned toward the main drag. Darn. I'd been hoping that he would eat all of it as we sat here. It was the whole reason I'd ordered cups instead of cones. I spooned away at my melted fudge concoction, stopping to ask a question just often enough to gauge his level of alertness. At some point, he was going to blink out in traffic, and I'd have to be ready to leap over the seat and take the wheel. He missed the entrance to the freeway, thank goodness, and then got confused about where to go. His head turned to the left and then the right as he worked to pick out a sign or landmark, something to tell him how to get back to the road to Barstow. We were nowhere close. He'd gotten onto a narrow paved lane that didn't seem to go anywhere, and by the time his head took the final dip into unconsciousness, we were a couple of miles out of town. Luckily, his foot slipped off the gas pedal and the SUV began to slow to a crawl. I dropped my dirty ice cream cup into Ollie's lap and reached over Mole's shoulders and took the wheel. We cruised ever so slowly onto a sandy berm, and the Explorer would not move another inch. I grabbed the keys from the ignition, feeling only mildly guilty that the robbers might cook to death inside the hot car. But hey, I was going to have to walk back to town. I wasn't leaving them with a usable vehicle. With a wary eye on the 3 sleeping men, I reached into the back of the SUV, dumped all the cash from their 3 pillowcases into one of them, and slung it over my shoulder. Then I ran for my life. Chapter 29. The puppy licked Drake's face a couple of times and then settled into his arms, falling into that immediate limp body sleep that puppies can do so effortlessly. He looked around, but the motel manager had vanished. Unless he tracked her down and handed the puppy back, it looked like he had a new dog. He walked into the command room to find the agents sitting around. The place had an air of delayed expectation, the lull before the event that happens when the stakes are high, but there is simply nothing to do until the game starts. Two of the men glanced up at him. Smiles appeared at the sight of the little dog in Drake's arms. "Hey, what you got there?" someone asked. Kingston reached out and rubbed the dog's ears.
"Cute little guy. What kind is he?"
"She," Drake said.
"I've no idea."
The group crowded around, letting the little foundling take their minds off the serious situation that had occupied them for more than 3 days now. They were speculating on what breed the dog might be, coming up with combinations, when Drake's cell phone rang deep in his pocket. He handed the puppy off to someone else and yanked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the readout.
"Drake Langston."
"Honey?"
"Charlie? Oh my God, where are you? Are you safe?"
Every person in the room froze. I'm not quite sure where I am, but I'm safe." Relief flooded through him.
"I'll come get you."
His voice cracked slightly, but Drake ignored the nudge from Kingston, who was trying to get him to hand over the phone. He heard her turn to someone else and ask a question. "I stopped at a house to use the phone. The lady says we're a few miles outside Seligman, Arizona?" Drake repeated the name of the town, and the agent who'd been on the computer raced back to his seat and brought up some maps.
"Let me speak to her,"
Kingston insisted. Drake gripped it tightly.
"I love you, sweetheart. We'll get you real soon."
Then he handed it over to the agent, who identified himself.
"Charlie, where are your captors?"
He listened to her brief answer.
"Can you get to a police department, a sheriff or someone like that?"
There was a long pause.
"Okay, do that. Good. Yes. Probably a few hours."
Drake chafed at hearing only half of the conversation. By the time Kingston handed his phone back, he'd estimated the time it would take him to fly to her. He stepped outside the room and spoke softly, reassuring her. When he walked back inside, his eyes were damp. The agents busied themselves at the computers, giving him a minute to regain his composure.
"I can get there by helicopter in 2 hours,"
he told Kingston.
"Let's charter a plane. It'll be quicker, hold more people."
For once, Drake didn't mind someone else taking charge. Chapter 30. The impact of the past few days began to hit me once the woman who'd let me use her phone took me to the Justice Court building in town, an unimposing one-story brown box. While she entertained a cadre of secretaries and a man who was apparently with the sheriff's department, with stories of how I'd shown up at her door, a bedraggled waif, I sat in a straight-back chair hugging a grimy pillowcase to my chest. I'd not yet told anyone what was in it. I supposed her description wasn't too far off the mark. I couldn't remember the last time I'd brushed my hair or washed my face. I'd had only one barely remembered shower in 4 days, and then dressed in the same sweaty, dirt-crusted clothing with which I'd begun this whole adventure. Yeah, waif probably fit the bill. I spotted a restroom at the far side of the room. "Mind if I—" One of the secretaries jumped up. "Oh, sure, honey. I can't imagine what you've been through." And I'm not supposed to tell you, I thought, remembering that FBI agent's instructions. The woman looked a little disappointed that I didn't offer up any juicy tidbits, but she ushered me toward the bathroom and pointed out where the soap and paper towels were. "Take your time, hon." Behind the closed door, I almost collapsed. A public bathroom, reasonably clean, felt like pure luxury. I wet paper towels and used generous amounts of the smelly liquid soap, anything to wipe away both the physical and emotional dirt. My hair was hopeless. All I could do was finger comb it and hold on to the hope that I would be at home in my own shower very soon. I stared at the grungy pillowcase that I'd tossed into the corner. The lumpy case was all that the bank robbery had netted those guys, and now they didn't even have that. The police or FBI or whoever was involved with this would want the whole story. Thinking about the debriefing to come made me realize that I still had a long way to go before I would be home again with Drake. When I walked back into the squad room, the deputy took over.
"We just heard from an Agent Kingston,"
he said. His voice was soft and kind.
"He says they are chartering a plane to come get you. Should be here in a couple of hours."
He gave me a look of wonder, obviously guessing at how important I was to warrant a chartered flight. I didn't mention that in some people's minds I was a famous movie star. I didn't say anything at all, just nodded.
"Could we get you something to eat, something to drink?"
A plate of Pedro's green chili chicken enchiladas and about 3 margaritas would be good. But again, I kept it simple. Yes, that would be nice. Anything at all. I felt like a lot of my usual zip had somehow zipped away. He sent someone out for a sandwich, then poured me a cup of coffee from an urn on a side table. I resumed my seat in the stiff chair, my bag of cash at my feet, and sipped the dark brew. It actually tasted amazingly good. I resisted everyone's questions while I sat at a desk and ate my sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on rye, which tasted like a banquet. Eventually, the lady who'd been my ride needed to get home to her cats, and the rest of them went back to their desks. I glanced at the wall clock and saw that it would be at least 90 minutes before Drake got here. So I rested my head on my arms and fell asleep. A small commotion infiltrated a weird dream I was having about trying to carry a bag with $1 million in it across the desert. Voices. One was Drake's. My eyes popped open and I stared around the unfamiliar room. 2 men in black jeans and windbreakers with FBI in bright yellow on the chests were talking with the deputy who brought me the sandwich. Drake was walking toward me. Nobody had ever looked so good. I tipped the chair over and leaped up and ran to his arms. He simply held me for a long, long time. Then there were kisses on my neck and face, and I think I was kissing him back. Hysterical laughter seemed to be bouncing between us.
"I called Ron and my mom. For a while there I was hoping you'd be able to get to her place."
You knew? You knew where I was?"
"Little bits of it."
He glanced toward the FBI men.
"You'll need to talk to the agents. Are you up for it?"
Do I have a choice? He smiled, that beautiful smile that grabbed my heart the first day I met him. I ran my hands over his chest, wanting to feel him, to know that he was real, wanting to hold on to him and not let go.
"I'll be with you,"
he said, as always dividing my thoughts before I'd fully formed them. A tall, gray-haired man with the bulk of a former football player who'd not run 100 yards in at least 30 years, introduced himself as Special Agent in Charge, Cliff Kingston.
"I'm the one you talked to today, when you called your husband."
Was that only a few hours ago? The day had passed in a blur. Kingston ushered us into an office he'd apparently commandeered, as the small facility didn't have interrogation rooms. Someone had stacked some file folders off to the side and furnished a pitcher of water and a stack of plastic cups. The head FBI man sat behind the desk. Another one with a laptop computer positioned himself to type up my statement, while Drake and I occupied the 2 chairs in front of the desk.
"It's okay, Charlie. The worst is over now. Just start at the beginning."
"But what about catching them now?" I'd told someone, I thought it was the sheriff who'd been here when I first arrived, about the Explorer I'd left behind with String, Mole, and Ollie in it.
"We're checking on that. For now, just tell me everything you remember."
So I did, from the moment the man with the shaky voice, who I'd later learned was Billy, grabbed me in the bank, through the whole crazy ride. He asked me to identify the 2 women from the place near Romeroville, but it seemed that he knew more about them than I did. All I could do was nod when he showed me their photos. I only saw them at a distance. From the back seat of the pickup truck, I heard 2 shots. I assumed the worst. He nodded.
"We found their bodies later that afternoon."
He asked me to identify other photos, mug shots of Leon Moeller and Lonnie Stringer, Mole and String. I told him the other 2 had been known among the gang as Kid and Domino, but in conversations with them, I knew them as Ollie and Billy. He made notes about that. Apparently they'd not identified them yet. I covered Billy's death, although I didn't have a clear idea where we were along the highway when it happened. He told me how they'd been so close to catching up with us at Stringer Farms, and how they'd identified the place. I choked up a bit when Drake described flying in there to get me and finding me gone. He pulled my blue ponytail band out of his pocket. I ran my fingers over it as though it were some foreign object. One of the sheriff's men tapped on the door.
"We found that explorer you told us about. Empty."
Kingston's mouth settled in a firm line. Drake and I exchanged a look, thinking the same thing. The 3 robbers were still on the loose. Chapter 31. Drake's surprise when we returned to Alamosa for the helicopter delighted me. She was a wiggly bundle of brown and white warmth who leaped straight into my heart. With a mass of adorable dots across her face, it was natural that we name her Freckles. My ordeal dimmed in a few days' time, and I began to settle back into my normal routine at home in Albuquerque. After that extensive debriefing and hours with a police sketch artist, the experience took on the quality of an especially vivid dream or a trip to an exotic place. Indelible in my mind, but somehow unreal. The only part that nagged at me was the fact that the robbers got away. The bank had been happy at the recovery of part of the stolen loot, and even I didn't believe String or Mole would be dumb enough to return to the same city and try it again. They'd been headed for California, and I hoped that's where they would stay. As for myself, I'd wanted to get back to the office immediately, but both Ron and Drake insisted that I take a few days off first. I ended up spending a lot more time than I ever do in front of the television. Media coverage of the story had, as usual, gotten a lot of the facts wrong. The robbery was reported to have netted the robbers more than $50,000. I'd counted $2,000 in the pillowcase I brought out with me and handed it over to Agent Kingston. 2 of the Albuquerque stations mentioned me, identified as a local woman who runs a private investigation firm. Miraculously, the part about the Christina Cross connection never got leaked to the press. I had to admire the way Kingston and his team had kept that whole bit under wraps. Once I was safe at home again, they must have let her producer know that life could proceed as usual. I saw her on some awards show in London just a couple of days after I got home. I didn't see the strong resemblance myself, but then I guess we never view ourselves the way others do. 3 days after my return to Albuquerque, I was standing at the bathroom mirror, realizing my hair seriously needed trimming.
"Hey, you,"
Drake said from the doorway.
"Brought you some coffee."
It's amazing how solicitous a guy will get when you've been away for a few days. Thanks. I took the mug and enjoyed a long sip.
"You sure you're okay with me taking on that photo shoot?"
Absolutely. I'm just glad they still wanted to do it after you had to cancel the original date.
Me too. But I'll be glad to cancel again if you're uneasy about being home alone.
I tossed a wet washcloth at him. This is the other thing about surviving a dangerous situation. We've been out to the gun range twice in the past 3 days. He bought me pepper sprays, enough for all my jacket and jean pockets, and he'd already begun encouraging Freckles into a frenzy whenever anyone came to the door. All the attention was beginning to wear, just a little, and I really could use an evening to kick back with a good book. I dabbed on some lipstick and rubbed my lips together, then bent down and called to the puppy. Hey, Freckles, come here, baby. She scrambled into the room, 4 paws slipping and going all directions on the tile floor. We still haven't figured out what breed she is, probably a mixture, so the whimsical name has just stuck. I jostled a little ball of fluff and kissed her on the nose. It's amazing how well she has filled the empty spaces in our lives where a dog really belongs.
Okay then, as long as you have Killer here to guard you.
I scooped up the fuzzy brown and white bundle and carried her along as I followed Drake to the front door, kissed him, and wished him luck with the job. 10 minutes later, I was on the way to the office, puppy at my side, to face the mountain of mail and calls that were probably awaiting me. I pulled around to the back of the gray Victorian, the Jeep finding its familiar parking spot beside Ron's Mustang and Sally's minivan. One more detail on the pathway back to normal life. Freckles immediately raced around the yard, finding all the scents of her predecessor and any strange wild critters that might have wandered in recently. I gave her a couple of minutes, but finally had to insist that we get to work. She zoomed toward the back door at my call, all flapping ears and scurrying paws. My heart did a little flip, and I laughed at her antics. Inside, the kitchen was deserted. Even the coffee carafe, which is normally ready by now, was gone. Ron must have carried it into his own office upstairs. Sally was no doubt at her reception desk, probably eager to catch me up on office happenings. I'd already talked to her on the phone and told her what I could about my own adventure. I let the puppy sniff around the kitchen while I meandered toward Sally's desk. The whole place seemed a little too quiet. 2 seconds later, I knew why, when a dozen people in the reception area shouted surprise. It was a good thing I hadn't followed Drake's advice and walked around with my gun drawn. I could see a light fixture or two meeting their demise. Familiar smiling faces watched my utter shock. "Welcome home, Charlie." Sally rushed forward to hug me. Victoria and Ron stood near the stairs. He grinned like the sneaky brother that he was. When my heart stopped pounding like a drum, I looked around and took stock. I spotted my good friend Linda Casper, and there was Gina from the bank. She rushed toward me with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Charlie, I'm so sorry that this happened to you." I tried to reassure her that I really was just fine. She had probably been more terrified than I at the moment those guys hauled me out the door. A few clients were here, and I did my best to play up Ron's involvement in tracking the bad guys and getting me back. No harm in putting our little investigation business in the best possible light. Kent Taylor, the APD homicide detective with whom I've had a few encounters, mostly friendly, stood near Ron. I noticed he was eyeing a cake that sat on the conference table, right by the missing coffee carafe. Sally bustled forward and tapped on the table to get everyone's attention. This sent the puppy into a frenzy, and it took a minute to reassure her that there was no intruder crisis. Sally gave a little welcome home speech that started me dabbing at my eyes, especially when she said that the cake had come from my favorite bakery in Taos, and that she'd driven up there to Sweet Sweets to pick it up yesterday afternoon. Well, that was the clincher. A fabulous cake and a lot of effort to get it. By the time she finished talking, everyone in the room was looking around for tissues. I performed the honors of cutting my cake, a triple chocolate torte filled with raspberries and trimmed in shaved almonds. I'm afraid that anyone who spoke to me in the next 10 minutes got a mumbled, crumb-filled answer. There was no way I was skipping my share of that fabulous confection. The crowd dispersed soon after, to duties in their own workplaces. I carried the remains of the cake to the kitchen and stowed it in the purple bakery box. Ron and Kent Taylor were standing there.
"Glad you're all right,"
Taylor said. He reached out and gave me a pat on the arm, probably the most caring gesture he'd ever shown toward me.
"You had a lot of us pretty worried."
"Aw, how sweet." But Ron's face looked serious.
"Is there anything new about the suspects?"
he asked. Taylor shook his head.
"It's not part of my division, but I don't think so. I talked with Dave Gonzalez yesterday, and he thinks they probably headed for California. One of the men had ties there, I guess."
I remembered something said during one of the endless days in the car, but when I'd mentioned it to the FBI men during my interview, it didn't seem like enough to really put them on the trail of the robbers. Taylor was giving me the eyeball.
"Don't you go getting involved in finding them, Charlie. There are plenty of law enforcement folks on this case already."
Professionals, he meant. Well, fine with me. I'd seen all I ever wanted to see of those guys. I caught Ron staring at the cake box, so I picked it up and carried it to my office. He could have more, but no way was he sneaking the whole thing while I wasn't watching. Freckles followed me up the stairs, her short legs barely clearing the risers. I had a feeling that situation wouldn't last for long. In just these few days, she'd already grown, and I wouldn't be surprised if we were dealing with a good-sized dog before long. She raced ahead, poking into each of the offices and the bathroom, almost immediately finding the tin of dog biscuits I'd always kept on my bookshelf. She plopped her little bottom to the floor and stared up at it wistfully. Well, what can I say? It was so darn cute that I had to give her one. Who's training whom here anyway? Watching the dog was, I must admit, just an excuse not to look at my desk. Sally had done her best to sort it and get rid of the junk that she knew I would have tossed out anyway. She'd handled some correspondence and left copies of the letters for me to read and file away. My accounting duties were mostly what remained, and I settled happily into the realm of receivables, payables, and payroll taxes. Weird, I know. Somewhere around noon, Ron stuck his head in around the door jamb and asked if I'd like to go out for some lunch. Since this almost never happens, I should have jumped at the chance, but I felt like I was just hitting my stride. There was a zillion computer entries to make, and I didn't especially want a break. Plus, I'd already sneaked a second piece of cake.
When I get back, maybe we can go over a couple of new cases,
he suggested. I nodded without taking my eyes off the computer screen.
Want me to bring you a sandwich?
Another nod. Anything light?
That was like telling Emerald to leave out the butter.
Ron gave me a puzzled look and left. Another hour must have passed. Somewhere in there he came back and put a ham sandwich on my desk. Sally buzzed me on the intercom and let me know that she was leaving for the day. She still likes her half-day schedule, picking up her little girl from kindergarten and being home to spend time with her hubby. Can't blame her for that. The bars of sun coming through my bay window completely changed angle the next time I noticed. I'd gotten out of my chair twice to take the puppy outside, but otherwise it came as a surprise to me that it was nearly 6 o'clock when Ron stepped into my doorway.
Never did get to those new cases, and now I have to run. Promise Victoria a date night.
I nodded. She and I had never made up our missed lunch from last week. I supposed I should suggest some kind of girls' day out. It's just that I'm not real big on that stuff. The whole mani-pedi spa thing always seemed like it would eat into my time for balancing ledgers, flying helicopters, or chasing down bad guys. I waved him out the door with a promise that we'd talk about the cases tomorrow. At some point, I noticed that the puppy was getting restless. Poor little thing was learning the hard way what a workaholic mom she had. Okay, we'll go home. I shut down the computer and tamped some invoices into a stack for tomorrow. Gathering my purse and the dog's leash, I switched out the lights and we headed downstairs. Sally had set the answering machine, and Ron left the night lamps on. All I had to do was coordinate getting the back door locked while dealing with a hyped-up puppy on a leash. I ended up deciding to get the dog to the car first and then go back to lock up. The leash and purse went into the back seat, and then I gave Short Stuff a boost into the passenger seat in front. I just double-checked the lock on the kitchen door when I sensed movement behind me. The hair on my neck rose.
"Hello, Charlie."
The voice was strings. Chapter 32. String stepped from behind the lilac bush at the corner of the building, pointing that very familiar pistol at me. No way. Before I could give it a second thought, I grabbed a pepper spray canister from my jeans and shot him full in the face with it. He dropped the pistol, screaming and grabbing at his eyes. I ran for my Jeep, dove in, and fumbled through my keys with shaking hands. I snapped the electronic door locks. The dog went into a frenzy, zipping around inside the car and barking like crazy as I started the engine and threw the thing in gear. I roared around the side of the office only to find a strange vehicle in the driveway blocking me. Someone sat in the front passenger seat. Mole. Without a second thought, I whipped the wheel to the left, taking out a flower bed and leaving tracks across the lawn. It felt like I flew off the curb and then hit the street with a hard jounce. One backward glance showed that Mole was getting out of the car. I didn't stick around long enough to find out any more than that. How had they found me? Questions raced through my head about as fast as my Jeep was racing through the streets. I made several quick turns through our quiet residential area, cut over to Central and turned west. Then it hit me. If they'd found my office, they might very well know where I lived. I couldn't go home. I kept going straight, heading across the river. At Coors Road, I turned north. This part of town has grown so quickly in recent years that I couldn't be sure what I would find, but at least there were lots of choices. I spotted a crowded, well-lit shopping center and pulled in, parked in a spot surrounded by other cars, facing outward for a quick getaway. My hands shook as I plucked my cell phone from my purse. Poor little Freckles was shaking beside me on the seat. What an introduction to life with Charlie. I pulled her onto my lap and petted her while I tried to think about what to do next. I didn't want to deliver this news to Drake yet, knowing he might still be in the air. I called Ron instead. I don't think I better go home, I said after explaining the melee at the office.
No, I wouldn't chance it.
I've got the number of that Agent Kingston somewhere here. I rummaged one-handed through my purse, holding the phone with the other.
Good. Call him, see what he advises. Do you want us to come out there?
I pictured Victoria being very unhappy at the idea of leaving their date night to come rescue the perpetually troubled little sister. No, I don't see any need for that. I'll figure out where to go and then I'll call you. I clicked off the call and punched in Kingston's number. He answered on the second ring. It was probably pretty rare that an FBI agent gave someone his personal cell number, so he must have known it was important.
I was afraid of that,
he said after I explained.
Hoping that those guys would stay in California was probably too wishful.
So, what should I do?
Is there a friend or a neighbor you could stay with?
I thought through my list. The neighbor who would take me in without a second thought, because she's already done so several times, is my surrogate grandmother, Elsa Higgins. But her house is right next door to mine. Going there wouldn't keep either of us very safe. Paranoia kicked in. I couldn't shake the idea that if String had found out my real identity and where I worked, he could track all my friends as well. Kingston must have read my mind, or maybe I said some of this out loud.
Look, he can't know everything, and he can't be everywhere. I'm getting some agents out to watch your house and your office. They'll be there within the hour. You should be safe enough with them around.
I hung up, every shred of skepticism working its way to the surface. Hey, I watch a lot of movies, and when the lone woman is told that the police are right outside guarding her, something always happens. Always. I pictured String and Mole, royally pissed because I'd taken their money and left them with groggy hangovers from the sleeping pills. I had no illusions about getting away as easily a second time. A cluster of motels and truck stops surrounded the area near the I-40 on-ramps. I passed them all up and drove several miles north where another bunch of hotels catered to the business traveler and the huge West Side Intel plant. Parking my Jeep in the lot of one such place, I walked about half a mile and checked into another one. The desk clerk gave me an odd look, obviously frazzled woman clutching a puppy under her arm and a cell phone in one hand while struggling to keep a purse strap over the shoulder. The guy couldn't figure out what my story was, but at least he didn't ask. He took my credit card and handed me a plastic key. I settled into a plain vanilla room and bolted the door every way I could. Freckles dashed about, checking out her third set of new surroundings in nearly as many days. Life must be quite the adventure to her. For my part, I was getting a little sick of the adventure and just wanted to move about freely in my own hometown without fear that some bad guy lurked in the bushes. I took stock of the room with its faux Euro bedding and flat-screen TV, noticed it had a minibar, and used it to make myself a fairly stiff rum and coke. Once the drink coursed its little version of relaxation therapy through me, I thought I finally had it together well enough to call Drake. I made light of the situation, saying that I'd spotted 2 of the bank robbers near the office and just felt better to be away from my familiar haunts tonight. He was tired, I could tell. The past week had been sheer hell for him, and now he was feeling the pressure of keeping the helicopter busy on some paying jobs. Gotta make those outrageous insurance payments. I gave him the name of the hotel and my room number. I'll meet you at the airport when you fly in tomorrow if you'd like.
Maybe I should join you in that hotel. By the tone of his voice, I knew he wasn't that tired.
Good idea.
Although I really couldn't see how a romantic interlude was going to happen, talking about the possibility definitely lightened my mood as I hung up. Unfortunately, the romance bubble popped a moment later when my cell phone rang. Ron. Where are you?
He asked with more than a hint of grumpiness in his voice.
You were going to call Kingston and then call me right back.
Sorry. I filled him in, letting him know that I didn't completely trust the FBI or the Albuquerque police to keep wily guys like String and Mole away from my house or office. I'm in a hotel now, but I'm a little worried about Elsa. If those guys know where I live and they're hanging around waiting for me to go home, and if she sees them and questions what they're doing there? I could just picture my 80-something neighbor demanding answers from a guy like String.
I'll go by and check on her. Meanwhile, give her a call and tell her not to open the door to anyone.
Trying to warn her about the danger and that she might spot cop cars around the house without really telling her why was no easy sell. Elsa still thinks of me as that teenager she took into her home after my parents died, and she doesn't really take "don't worry about it" as an answer. I did my best and told her to expect Ron within a few minutes. Let him cover the tough questions. Gradually, the toll of the long day and the scare began to coalesce into a dull fatigue in my bones. I took a shower and turned on the television, relying on old reruns of Frasier to lift my mood and take my mind off real life. Freckles curled up next to me, and her warm little body worked to reassure me that there really are good things in this world. Somehow, I slept in a deep, dreamless state until I began to hear the morning movements of other guests opening and closing their doors along the corridor. I stretched and hugged the puppy before it hit me that the new day was beginning with a big question. Now what? Chapter 33. I threw my clothes back on, walked Freckles outside, and grabbed a bagel and a cup of coffee from the free breakfast bar provided by the hotel, and decided I better take stock of the day. I couldn't live like this, in a hotel room wearing the same clothes day after day, trying to care for a puppy and not even being able to go to my home or office in my own hometown. It was ridiculous. A call to Kingston netted me the answer that they were still watching my place but had seen no trace of the bad guys. I expressed my frustration.
I'll get you an escort, someone to go with you wherever you need to go.
Gee, that wasn't going to be a whole lot better than having the 24/7 company of the gang, now was it? At least this time the guns would be pointed away from me instead of toward me. I grumbled, but agreed. Can I make contact with the agents watching my house? I need to get some things, food for the dog, stuff like that.
I was about to send the overnight watch crew home. I'll meet you there myself.
Whatever. 20 minutes? That was wishful, I knew, in the morning rush traffic. But I couldn't sit around here much longer. He said he'd be there. 45 minutes ticked by, and I fumed the whole time, unaccustomed as I'd become to driving across this city during the heaviest traffic hours. But eventually I pulled into my driveway, feeling on hyper-alert for anything unusual. Everything seemed just fine, including the dark agency car out front. Kingston stepped out of it as I exited the Jeep.
I walked around back, checked the windows and doors. Everything looks good.
Maybe they aren't as bright as we're giving them credit for.
Don't get too complacent. The fact that they came back to Albuquerque tells me they're pretty desperate. Your name wasn't mentioned on the news, so we can't discount that they had some way to figure out who you were and where your office is.
My guts tightened up again, just when I thought I'd been feeling a tiny bit less vulnerable. I stared at my front door.
Charlie, I'd recommend that you stay hidden away for a few more days. Give us the chance to use our resources and catch these guys.
It probably made sense, but the instructions chafed at me. Give me 15 minutes. Freckles followed me onto the porch and I unlocked the front door. She dashed past me into the living room. A small sheet of paper drifted across the hardwood floor at the entry. I bent to pick it up, but stopped cold. Agent Kingston, you better come see this. Bold words in black marker covered the page. You took our money. Kingston appeared at the open front door. I pointed at the note. They must have slipped it under the door. When could they have done that?
Sometime before my agents arrived. They watched the place all night and no one approached this door.
I went back over the previous afternoon in my head. It was nearly dark when I left the office and encountered String. After I made my mad dash across the lawn and over the curb, they must have come here and left me this warning. They may have even staked out the house, hoping I would come right home, until the government cars began showing up in the neighborhood. Kingston picked up the note by one corner and went out to his vehicle to get an evidence bag for it.
Not that we need any more proof about where this came from, but every little bit helps make the case in court.
Yeah, I suppose that once I was dead, it would be helpful to prove who'd come after me.
I hope I don't have to argue with you about being extra careful.
I put a hand on my fluttering stomach. No argument here.
I'll wait with you until you pack a few overnight items. You should go back to the hotel.
He stepped inside and closed the front door. I watched him go to the front window and take a position so that he faced my Jeep in the driveway, peering through the sheer drapes. While he stood vigil, I gathered all the new amenities we'd purchased for Freckles: crate, blankets, food, dishes, leash, and toys. It's amazing how much stuff a new baby needs. Then I packed a small bag for myself. I want to check on my elderly neighbor. It'll just take a minute, I told Kingston. Without waiting for an okay, I dialed Elsa's number. I'm making a vacation out of it, she said after telling me she talked to Ron last night. My cousin in Portland is always begging me to visit. This looks like a good time. Your brother is picking me up at noon and taking me to the airport. Bless her. What a trooper she is. I felt about 1,000,000% better when I hung up. I called Ron's cell immediately and told him to watch her until she was safely past security in the airport. He acted as if I were treating him like an idiot for telling him all this. Maybe I was. Everything felt extremely jumbled up right now. My small suitcase joined the stack of doggy goodies by the front door. Are there any leads at all? Anything on these guys' whereabouts? I asked Kingston.
We questioned all known relatives of Stringer and Moeller, right after we got you back from Arizona. As of last night, we've had someone watching each of their homes, put the word out among informants on the streets.
And nothing?
It can take time. Guy like Moeller with his history of drug deals, he's gonna show up at his old haunts eventually.
Eventually. That sounded like a long time to me.
Ready?
He walked out to the porch ahead of me, scanning the street carefully. I had to give the guy points for trying to keep me safe. I put the loaded dog crate and my own bag in the back of the Jeep and coaxed Freckles up to the passenger seat. I'll be at my office, I told him.
That's not...
It's happening. It may not be the safest place, but I have a job to do, and I've already been away from it for too long. I'll go to a hotel tonight.
Before nightfall. And don't walk outside alone. Not out the door, not down the street.
He stood beside my door, his eyes scanning the street as we walked. Sheesh. I gritted my teeth. Taking orders goes against my grain, and hiding out is definitely not my lifestyle.
At the office, keep all the doors locked. Instruct your people to admit only known persons.
He caught my erupting protest.
I wouldn't put it past these guys to try to force their way in.
Surely they don't think I have their money. He held up the plastic bag with the note.
Well, you are the one they're coming to. They seem to think you can get that bank money back for them.
Valid point. But so illogical. I fumed as I locked my doors and started the Jeep. Kingston went back to his vehicle, and I could see him talking on the handheld radio. I spotted two strange vehicles on the street where our office is. A van with the windows darkened, way too shiny and new for Stringer Mole. The little antenna spiking up from the roof spelled government. Same for the gray car with two guys in suits about half a block away. I gave them a tiny wave as I passed. Both Ron's and Sally's vehicles were parked in their usual places. An armed man in uniform stepped out from behind an ancient elm at the corner of the property when I pulled in. Once he saw it was me, he blended back into the shrubbery. I sighed. Ron had apparently gotten the new office protocol, too. The back door was locked and the pulled-down shades were closed. I unlocked my way in and called out. No telling how edgy everyone else might be by now. At least the coffee machine was full. I retrieved the bakery box with the remains of yesterday's decadent chocolate cake from my office, and it didn't take more than a couple of minutes for both Sally and Ron to show up. So, I didn't know what else to say.
So I guess we wait this out,
Ron said. I looked over at Sally. You don't have to be here. Ron piped up.
We've already discussed it.
I'll stay until my normal time today. That way, someone is with you until Ron gets back from the airport, Sally said. Depending on how things go, I'd rather that you stay home tomorrow and until these guys are caught. Even though they didn't harm me before, there's no telling what they might do now. She nodded. I also noticed that she gulped. You've got a small child, a husband who needs you. I don't want to put you at risk. I know. We were already talking about going away for the weekend. I'll convince Ross that we should do it. Good. She gave me a long hug. I'd stay if it would help you out. I know you would, but it's not necessary. I turned and rummaged through a drawer for a knife to cut the cake. Ron sent a worried look at me behind Sally's back. He said,
Okay, that's the plan. I'll be back from the airport before 1 o'clock, and then you'll join up with your family and take a nice little summer vacation.
With pay, I added, handing her a plate with a thick slice on it. She headed back to her desk, and I turned to Ron. Okay, that plan gets us through to early afternoon. What then? The quick answer came when my cell phone rang, down inside my pocket. Drake.
Hi, hon. Everything going all right this morning?
Rotor noise filled the background. So far, so good. How about you? Job done? There was an affirmative answer, but the background noise was getting louder. Do you still want me to pick you up when you get here?
Well, that's the thing. I got a call. There's a brush fire south of Los Lunas, and I need to go there. Will you be all right?
Poor guy. He'd taken so much time off this past week to watch out for me. I couldn't ask him to pass up any new jobs. I assured him that I'd be fine, but told him about Kingston's instructions to stay in a hotel again. We agreed to touch base later in the day. Ron had disappeared with a hunk of cake, and I found him in his office. Okay, what next? I said, leaning against the door jamb. I hate living on the run from these guys. And you know good and well that the minute the FBI gets a more urgent call, this case will go straight to the back burner. He nodded, which sent chocolate crumbs all over his shirt front. I can't keep living in hotels, watching every shadow on the windows.
Kingston says they're watching for Stringer and Moeller around their old haunts, but that won't last long.
Exactly. It's fine to think that I have some protection out there, Ron, but I'm not good at waiting around. I have to be proactive. I walked over to his window that faced the street. Both the van and the car were still in place, for now.
You have your weapon with you?
I patted my purse.
Keep it on your person. You leave the purse in your desk when you go downstairs. You should have it where you can get your hands on it.
I wanted to resent the advice, but had to admit that the gun, in my purse, in the car, had done me no good yesterday. It was having the pepper spray in my pocket that had saved my bacon that time. I set the purse on his desk, retrieved the pistol, and stuck it in my waistband. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and reassuring. I have a ton of invoicing to do. Pop over across the hall if you come up with a plan for what we should do next. I settled at my desk and Freckles lay at my feet. The bonding was pretty cute to watch. Better than watching for bad guys any day. Emails, invoicing, and computer entries soaked up my attention for a while. Longer than I imagined, because the next thing I knew, Ron was standing there. In his hand, a sheet of paper.
Found these addresses, last known residences of Stringer and Moeller, plus some relatives. I think I'll do a little drive-by of my own, now and then. The third guy can't find anything without a last name.
I never knew what it was. The older men called him Kid. Billy, the younger one who was killed, called him Ollie. That's not a lot to go on.
I think I'll put in a call to Detective Gonzalez. Based on what their sketch artist did when you worked with them, maybe they've come up with something. I don't know how much Gonzalez will tell me, but we'll see.
I'd given it a lot of thought in recent days, but still didn't really have any firm information I could offer about the third man. He seemed so innocent. Well, maybe naive was a better word, in retrospect. The teenager who'd somehow gotten in with a couple of really bad dudes. Considering what had happened to Billy, I wondered if Ollie were even alive now. Chapter 34. Oliver Wendell Trask crouched beside a blue dumpster in a dark, stinking alley. His hands were coated in grime, his hair and clothing reeked of used cooking grease and rotted vegetables from a quick foray into the dumpster for anything edible. Mama would have belted him across the mouth for consuming the stuff he'd just put in there. A half-eaten burger and a few ribs with some of the meat still on them. But that was back when she still cared what he ate, when she cared whether he bathed. By the time he'd hit high school, the daily battles became too much for either of them. She'd run off with some guy, one of the many. He'd dumped the pretense of attending class and fended for himself ever since. He looked at his hands and cringed. He wasn't fending all that well right now, for sure. This whole week had turned into a pile of crap. A door opened, and a man in white kitchen garb stepped out and flung 2 bulging bags into the open trash bin. Ollie pressed himself into the wall at his back, but the man saw him anyway.
"What are you doing out here? Get moving!"
Ollie leaped to his feet and ran down the alley. There just wasn't enough fight left in him for another confrontation. Not like there used to be, even a few days ago. The day he'd questioned String about his share of the bank money. That turned into a nasty scene with String taking aim at Ollie with that pistol. Ollie scrambling to get away, bumping into String, making him shoot a hole in the ceiling of some trailer they'd broken into and spent their first night back in Albuquerque. He'd been on the run ever since. He reached the mouth of the alley and stared at the street. Didn't recognize this part of town. Didn't really matter. He had no money, no car, and no place to go. He waited for a clear spot in the traffic and dashed across to a small park. Streetlights cast small puddles of golden light around the edges of it, but the middle was a black mass of bushes and trees. He headed for the darkest area and flopped to the ground with his back against the trunk of some huge tree. The whole dream had turned out so badly. His plan, the house for Rena Lynn, the convertible, their life together. It seemed so far away now. He tried to call her 2 days ago when he still had a few coins in his pocket. An answering machine came on. When had they gotten that? And the payphone wouldn't give him back his money. He thought of trying to call Sadie, but wasn't at all sure that his mother would accept a collect call from him, and that would depend on locating her anyway. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, and it wouldn't surprise him if she'd found herself a new man by now. She might not even live in this city anymore. No, he wasn't that desperate yet. He'd passed a 24-hour laundromat earlier in the day. This late, there might be a good chance of finding it empty. He could wash up in the restroom, might even find some clean clothes. Could probably figure out a way to get some money out of the place. Those little cash businesses, a place like that would be full of dollar bills and coins and everything. He would clean up, find enough money for real food, and then he'd call Rena Lynn again. Or maybe he'd ride the bus up to her place. They could still run off together, even without the money he'd hoped for. Her dad gave her a car when she graduated last month, a used Honda. Pretty nice little ride, even if it wasn't exactly a hot car. It would get them out of Albuquerque, and then they could find a place to get married and settle down. To hell with String and his big plans. Chapter 35. Ron had called in sometime around mid-afternoon. Besides cruising past the addresses he'd gotten for relatives of String and Mole, we did still have a business to run here. He'd gone down to the courthouse to research some records for one of the law firms that regularly hires us. Paperwork finished by 5 o'clock. I was really in the mood to go home for a long nap on the couch, followed by making a nice dinner for Drake. But with my husband out fighting a fire, we never knew how long those could go on. And me living in a hotel with neither comfy couch nor my own kitchen facility, probably the best I could hope for was a night of TV in a generic room. Freckles had snoozed the afternoon away beside my desk in almost the exact spot her predecessor always chose. But now she was up and restless. A restless puppy should never be ignored. We weren't all that certain of her house training just yet. She raced me down the stairs and to the back door, but I wasn't keen on dashing out there to find another surprise visit from an unwelcome guest. I clipped the leash onto her tiny collar and led her to the front door instead. A peek out the side glass reassured me that the FBI van was still in place, 2 doors down. I scanned the street. The man behind the wheel of the gray car raised his fingers in salute and gave a tiny wave back. All looked normal. Finished with her business, Freckles pulled me back to the front door. She was gaining strength every day, and I had a feeling leash training better be in the plan pretty soon. At our initial visit to the vet, the day after we'd brought her home, the doctor said we could expect her to grow up to 50 pounds or so. I needed to establish early on just who was really in charge here. In keeping with that, I followed her into the kitchen and filled her food bowl. While she wolfed through her food, I phoned the agents out front to let them know I was ready to leave, then put away my files, shut down the computer, and turned out the lights upstairs. Rechecked the front door and windows, turned on the proper night lights, and worked my way to the back door and peeked out the window. The uniformed officer stood near my Jeep, which was reassuring. If only it always worked this smoothly. But when I opened the back door to leave, a piece of paper fluttered to the kitchen floor. The bold black marker strokes were way too familiar. "You owe me $50,000. Chapter 36. The plan went pretty smoothly. Ollie found the laundromat, even though it was a bit farther than he'd remembered. Bright fluorescent lighting cast white squares across the sidewalk out front, and from a vantage point at the dark side of the parking lot, he could tell it was empty. He walked in, hoping the air conditioning would offset the heavy summer night, but a couple of dryers were running, gobbling up any coolness from the big overhead register. He checked some doors at the back of the place. One went into an empty bathroom. The other was locked. Probably a supply closet or something. At least there was no one around. He rummaged through the dryers and came up with a pair of jeans and t-shirt that would fit him. He closed the dryer door and tossed the clothing into the restroom, in case their owner showed up. With a casual swagger, he cruised past the change machine, a thing that would fill your hands with quarters if you just fed in enough $1 or $5 bills. The box-like metal had been welded repeatedly and looked stronger than Fort Knox. An industrial-sized padlock held it all together. He gave it a tug. It was tight enough to protect an armored car. Well, shit. Ollie helped himself to a washcloth from the bounty in the dryer and went into the restroom where he did a respectable wash-up, what his mother would have called a spit bath, and changed into the clean clothes. He heard a sound and peered out through the crack near the door jamb. A set of headlights pulled up to the front door of the place, and a harried-looking woman in a waitress uniform jumped out of a small white car. She rushed in, opened the dryer door, and patted the clothes inside. They were dry enough to suit her, and she heaped them into the basket she'd brought with her, then bustled back out to the car and was gone within minutes. Okay, the danger of being caught in someone else's clothes was gone, but he still had no cash. He eyed the door next to the bathroom. Locked doors always intrigued him. They didn't usually stop him, either. With a glance back at the front windows to be sure no one was watching, he backed up and gave it a hard kick. The deadbolt lock held tight, but the hollow core door splintered. 2 more kicks and he got his hand inside. A twist of the deadbolt and he was in. Cartons of those tiny soap boxes lined one wall. A mountain of paper towels and toilet paper rolls filled another corner. In the middle of the room stood an industrial-sized mop and bucket, and some brooms leaned against shelving that held the paper towels. As his father would have said, all that stuff was as useless as tits on a boar. But maybe... He spotted a metal toolbox on the floor. No ring of keys to unlock the trove of coins in the machines. Damn it. But a quick search did net him a hefty pry bar. "That's better," he muttered. Back at the change machine, he debated how to tackle the heavy padlock. The pry bar didn't have much effect when he tried to snap it open. But one of the welds on the strapping that held the machine to the wall looked a little weak. He applied all the torque he could muster. He felt something move. A little more pressure, a little more shift. Something about the sound of the air conditioning changed, a subtle altering of the air in the building. He turned around. "Freeze right there!" A damn cop holding a gun on him. "You're under arrest." He dropped the pry bar and watched his whole plan vanish into thin air. Chapter 37. I must have shrieked, just a tiny bit, when the sheet of paper fluttered to my feet, because the officer out by my car came running toward me. "How did this get here?" I demanded. He stammered a little while, but I built up more steam. "Weren't you here all afternoon? How did someone get up to this door? How did they plant this note?" I eyed the back fence, which divided our property from a similar one on the street to the north. He reached for his shoulder mic and mumbled some kind of numerical code, not even attempting to answer my questions. In about 5 seconds, 2 more men came running up the driveway, the guys from the gray car. Good. I'd like to hear how he explained this to them. We spent another 10 minutes with a whole lot of mumbo about did I recognize the handwriting, did I think it was from the same sender as the last note, and a bunch of other questions that could have been answered with, "Well, yeah." Someone finally called Agent Kingston, and he made the sensible suggestion that they bag the note and that someone should escort me to my hotel and see that I was in for the night safely. And somehow, even though that hadn't sounded so appealing an hour ago, it was looking pretty good now. I'd chosen a different hotel and made a reservation earlier in the day, opting for one that was somewhat closer than the far northern end of Coors Road, and which put me on a 10th floor in a class of hotel where anyone the likes of String or Mole would stand out and immediately be spotted by on-site security. The business of avoiding kidnappers sure could get expensive. I checked in with Drake and told him my new location. He was 50 miles from home, and the fire boss wanted him to stay at the hasty base camp they'd set up, to assure that he would be available again at daybreak. Looked like it was room service for Freckles and me. Sick of fast food and cheap motels. Or maybe it was simply that my recent experiences of sleeping on couches and floors was still too fresh. I splurged on a meal and wine that set me back almost as much as the cost of the room where I'd stayed the last night. Call me a snob, but I felt like it was about time to treat myself a little better. I set Freckles' little crate under a painting that purported to be an R.C. Gorman, closed the floor-to-ceiling drapes, and nestled into my 500-count sheets, with a comforter that must have been stuffed with dandelion fluff on top of me. And thus I stayed, without rolling over once, until my cell phone rang on the nightstand. The bedside clock said it was 5:12 a.m.
"Miss Parker, this is Detective Dave Gonzalez, APD.
I think I groaned. Would there ever again be a time in my life that I could get a whole day and night without at least one call from law enforcement?
We're holding a suspect downtown that we think might be the third man from the bank robbery. I know this is a lot to ask, but could you come down and identify him?"
I sat up in bed and scrubbed sleep grains out of my eyes. "Now?"
"He's going over to a cell in the detention center in about an hour. After that, it gets a little harder to arrange all this. If you could take a look while we still have him in an interrogation room, it really simplifies things."
"It will take me a little while to get organized." I was surprised I could even think about being organized this early. Must have been because I fell asleep before 9 o'clock last night. "I'll be there within the hour." My idea of lounging about in the hotel's thick terry robe, followed by another decadent room service order, went the way of all my other plans recently. I took a very quick shower and put on fresh clothes, then put the puppy in her crate and assured her I would be back soon. The sun would peek over Sandia Crest in another few minutes, but already the day was beginning to press in with summer heat. I headed west to the police station and parked. Gonzalez came out for me within moments before I ever told the desk officer my name.
"Charlie, good to see you looking so rested and refreshed."
I nodded at the tall, tan-complected detective. The last time I'd seen him was during one of my debriefings after 4 days on the run. He led the way down a couple of corridors and stopped at a door on the right.
"I remembered that you said the third man in the gang was named Ollie. Lucky I happened to be here when they brought in this kid. He was trying to break into the change machine at a coin laundry. His name is Oliver Trask."
Gonzalez ushered me into a small room, which was lit only by a dim overhead fixture. Most of the light came from a window set in one wall, a two-way mirror that revealed an interrogation room. The kid at the table was Ollie, all right. He looked thinner than I remembered, and his blonde hair lay in greasy strands, One end of his shaggy mustache stuck out at a funny angle. He wore a t-shirt that said Jesus loves you and didn't appear to have any socks on with his sneakers. Mainly, he looked alone and scared. I nodded at Gonzalez. That's him.
I'll turn on the sound,
he said in a low voice.
You wait here. I'll go in there. So far, he's only been questioned about tonight's incident, with a few questions about where he was the day of the bank robbery. I want to see what else we can get out of him, and then I'll check with you to see how much of his story is true.
He flipped a switch, picked up a can that I hadn't noticed on the console, and left the room. A second later, the door to the other room opened, and Gonzalez joined Ollie at the table.
Hey, Ollie, brought you a Coke.
The cop set the can down in front of his suspect. Ollie stared at the can but didn't pick it up.
When can I go home? You don't have much experience at this, do you, son? You're not going home right away. Even if we had all the answers we need from you, nobody's come to post your bond yet.
Ollie's gaze darted around the room as he performed some kind of mental Rolodex search for a name, someone who would come down here and get him out.
You see, Ollie, there's more than just that half-assed attempt you made to get the money at the laundromat. You've been identified as one of the men involved in a bank robbery kidnapping last week.
I swore that Ollie's eyes fixed right on me. Chapter 38. I stepped back from the glass, a little unnerved by the penetrating stare. Gonzalez slapped the table, snapping Ollie's attention back to the question at hand.
You haven't exactly come up with a very good explanation of where you were last Friday through Monday, and no one who can verify an alibi for you. So you see, we'll be needing to keep you here until we can do that. I told you I borrowed a guy's car and drove to Texas. By myself. Yeah, well, there's a motel clerk who remembers some of that, but he says you didn't even stay the night. You were there a few hours and then you left. Where'd you go after that?
Ollie fidgeted in his chair. He picked up the open can of Coke and took a swallow, but then he choked on it and sputtered a little. Gonzalez sat quietly, his eyes never leaving the young guy's face. Ollie wiped his mouth on his shirt sleeve and shuffled in his seat some more. He couldn't seem to figure out what to do with his hands. He wanted so badly to look cool and in control, but he just wasn't pulling it off. Gonzalez waited. I wondered if all interrogations involved this much silent staring. Finally, the cop gave a big sigh.
Okay, Ollie, tell you what. There's a lot that we do know about that bank job, so maybe if I throw out a few details, you can help fill in the blanks.
I could see the younger guy's wheels turning.
We know the identities of two of your accomplices, Leon Moeller and Lonnie Stringer. They're guys with records, lot of unsavory stuff. Too bad that they weren't put away sooner, because this time they pulled a really bad one. Bank robbery and kidnapping are federal offenses. You know what that means? Longer prison terms, less likelihood of parole. Then there are the murders of Billy Hatchett, Melinda Davies, and Sissy Davies.
Ollie gulped visibly when Gonzalez mentioned the murders.
For all we know, you might have been the guy who pulled the trigger on at least one of those murders.
Ollie's hand shook when he reached for the Coke can. He thought better of it and put the hands back in his lap. Gonzalez ran a hand over his shaved head.
You know, this state can't seem to figure out whether we want the death penalty or not. Sometimes it's in, sometimes it's out. No telling which way it'll go by the time your case comes up.
The detective changed his tone, turning almost cheerful.
I'm gonna grab a cup of coffee. Want one? No? Okay, I'll be right back.
Ollie slumped in his chair the minute Gonzalez was out the door. As the detective stepped into the room where I stood watching, Ollie began to weep quietly. He raked his fingers through his hair and pounded his forehead against the table.
We'll let him stew for a few minutes, hopefully long enough to get him to turn on the others.
He turned to me.
Is there anything you can think of that I can use as ammunition?
I glanced back at Ollie. He'd never seemed like a hardened criminal to me, more like a kid who was desperately grasping for approval, anyone's approval. He told me that he was once pretty close to Sissy Davies. She wasn't technically related, but he called her Aunt Sissy. Her death has to be weighing pretty heavily on him.
Gonzalez nodded. We didn't know about that yet.
Billy's death might too. I don't know. I didn't get a sense that they were close buddies, though. I think they only met recently. But String's shot, the one that killed Billy, it went right past Ollie's head. It shook him up.
Good. I mean, that's helpful.
Gonzalez left again, was gone a few minutes, and then entered the interrogation room with a cup of coffee in his hand.
Okay, Ollie, where were we?
He stirred the coffee with one of those little wooden sticks and blew on the surface of the hot liquid.
Oh yeah, death penalty. Well, I'll tell you right now that we easily have enough evidence to put Stringer and Mulder away. And it's either going to be a life sentence or the death penalty. That's pretty much a sure thing.
He watched Ollie over the top of his cup as he took a sip.
You and Billy Hatchet are equally culpable. That means responsible. Under the law because you were there. Just taking part in a crime where someone dies makes everyone guilty. Just in case you hadn't already learned that from watching a lot of TV.
He took another slow sip, wasted another minute by staring into the cup, stirring it again with a little stick, blowing on the coffee. By this time, Ollie was shifting in his seat like he was about to wet his pants.
Only thing I need now is to get my hands on those other two. That's it.
Gonzalez sipped again.
We know they're back in the city. It's only a matter of time before they screw up and we catch them. And you know what? It'll be something stupid like the way we got you. Some dumb break-in for a few bucks.
Ollie's fingers drummed on the table now.
See, the thing is, I'd really hate to see another innocent person get hurt when that happens, because then it's the death penalty for sure. And I'm not so sure that we couldn't get your name tacked onto the list for that same sentence. Just depends on how good a lawyer you can afford.
He chuckled.
Oh, I forgot. You didn't even have a quarter to your name. That's why you thought you had to knock over a laundry.
I didn't do none of that shit, Ollie cried out. I didn't go to the bank. I didn't shoot nobody. I didn't even get a share of the money.
His voice cracked.
Gonzalez let the words hang in the air for a minute.
Really? None of the bad stuff? Well, then it's really a pisser that your name's going on that indictment.
Well,
unless...
Ollie went for the bait. Unless what? Maybe I can get some kind of deal?
Well, I don't know. Like I said, we already got all the evidence we really need.
You need to find them, though. I can help you. Gonzalez was as cool as I'd ever seen. He rubbed at his chin while Ollie repeated the offer twice more.
How are you going to do that?
I got to thinking, Ollie said, his voice as animated as one of the little rascals when they set out to make plans. There's this house String owns. He doesn't always stay there. It's more like a safe house. Yeah, I think that's what he called it. His safe house.
And you think you would go there now?
Yeah, sure. Makes sense, doesn't it? He said even his mother don't know about it.
But you do. You know where it is.
There was this one night when we was hiding out at this farmhouse somewhere in Colorado, and String starts drinking and we was all playing cards and stuff. Right after that, he had the idea that the movie star lady would be worth a whole bunch of money. And Mo's asking him about how that would work, how we get the money and divvy it up. Gonzalez was writing notes on a yellow pad now. And String says that he'd meet the guy who's bringing the money, and then we'd all meet up at String's house in Bernalillo, and he'd give us each a share.
But you were all headed to California together. So why come back to New Mexico and divide the money?
Oh, well, String said it'd be safer that way. I sputtered out loud. How absolutely dumb could this guy be?
Where in Bernalillo?
Gonzalez asked. Huh?
Where is the house?
I had to admire his ability to separate out the bullshit parts of the kid's story and stay with what he needed to know, where to find String now. He told Mole you take the main road into town heading north. 2 streets past this one Chevron station, 4th house on the left. Gonzalez asked a few more details, but I lost track. I too remembered something String had said about having a safe house in Bernalillo. He'd hinted that the house was full of contraband. Was Ollie setting us up? Chapter 39. Gonzalez came back into the observation room with me, while another officer cuffed Ollie and took him away.
Finally. Looks like we might have a solid lead on a place to look. I'll get out there and check out that house.
Dave, I don't know if that's a good idea. He gave me a quizzical look. When Ollie mentioned the house, I remembered a comment String made.
And you didn't think to mention?
I know, I'm sorry, it just...
Tell me.
As Ollie said, there was one night at the farmhouse when the men were drinking and playing cards. I had duct tape around my wrists and ankles, and I was sitting in a corner of the kitchen dozing about half the time, trying to plan a way out. Well, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the men. String tended to brag a lot. He twirled his hand in the air to make me hurry up. I think the house may be filled with weapons and explosives.
What?
String did kind of mention a safe house. It came up while the guys were talking about the guns they'd used in the robbery. Mole admired one of the pistols. String said he had a place where he kept a whole lot more than those. Made it sound almost like an armory or something. Then he went off into bragging about how during his time in the army he worked with C4 and a lot of explosives.
He might have. We do show that he did an army stint in the mid-80s. I can check further on that.
What I'm saying is that he's a really unbalanced dude. You can't believe the crazy. I'm talking insane look he gets in his eyes. Dave, what if he was willing to blow the whole place up if your men cornered him there?
It could be a Waco-like scene, except that this place isn't out in the middle of nowhere. There are other houses all around.
I nodded. Yeah. He gripped the coffee cup that he'd carried in with him and stared at a spot in the middle of space.
Okay, thanks. We'll have to figure out our best approach.
He opened the door and held it for me. Wait, I have an idea. He paused, eyebrows raised. Let me be the bait and bring him out into the open, somewhere far away from his own turf.
Absolutely not. No way. Forget it.
He was sounding a little too much like my husband now. Think about it, Dave. String has been sending me these notes demanding money. The media said the robbers got away with $50,000 and he thinks I have it. I know, it's crazy. There was nowhere near that much and a lot of it was ruined by the die. But he's got this idea that I can deliver a bunch of cash to him. What if we just played along with that?
I can't put a civilian at risk like this.
He walked out into the corridor, headed toward the squad room. I tagged along. So what? You tell him to meet up with a police officer and trust String to show up just because he's fixated on the money? That's not exactly going to work. Gonzalez flopped into the chair at his desk, looking like he'd give anything to come up with a better idea so he could send me home. I'm not going to meet with the guy in some dark alley. We'd choose a place that's nice and open. You'd set your men up in advance to grab them. I'll wear a vest and carry a weapon.
No. More civilians get hurt when they brandish a weapon at a criminal than you'd like to believe.
I had a feeling this might become our sticking point, so I just kept my mouth shut. He tapped a pen against the yellow pad that contained his notes from the interview with Ollie. I could see his wheels turning.
Let's say that I did agree with this plan, and let's say that we could find a good spot to do it, where we could control the action. How would we contact Stringer and Moeller and get them to come?
I sat in the visitor chair beside the desk. I hadn't gotten quite this far in the plan. I would have to talk to him.
I don't like it.
Truthfully, I didn't like it much either, once I thought about it. I tapped a fingernail on the desktop as I considered what to do. Okay, how about this? He found my office and confronted me there once. Then he left 2 notes. He'll come back. I outlined the rest of the steps basically as I thought them up. Chapter 40. From the bay window in my darkened office, I scoped out the street below. Street lamps illuminated the pre-dawn neighborhood, where nothing had moved since I arrived 30 minutes ago. The 2 government vehicles had not been back since yesterday, although their earlier presence had not exactly deterred String from approaching the building with his most recent note.
"Clear in the back,"
Ron called out.
"We better get moving."
I grabbed up the note I'd written earlier, telling String that I had the money and wanted to meet. We made our way down the stairs, leaving the normal daytime lights on throughout the offices. Ron peeked through the curtains at the back window, rechecking the parking area, before giving me the go-ahead. We locked the door and I stuck the note in the jam, then hurried to his car. I ducked into the back seat and stayed low while he pulled out. My Jeep stayed behind. Everything about the place was meant to look as if I were working here alone. Now all I had to do was stay somewhere out of sight until String found the note and called the phone number I'd written there. It went to a cell phone that APD gave me, one they could easily monitor. Ron drove through the semi-residential neighborhood of our office at his normal pace, and then he told me I could raise up once we got to the busier streets beyond. Within 15 minutes, he delivered me to my uptown hotel, where Drake and Freckles had just come in from her morning walk. "Did you leave a note on the door at home?" I asked.
"Yep, as ordered."
Drake pulled me into his arms, but I found it hard to relax into the embrace as I normally love to do. "I feel jumpy as a cat until we hear something. No, make that until those 2 are locked away."
"I know. We'll all be relieved when this is over."
Poor thing. He's put up with a lot of drama in my life. I would have to think of a suitable thank you that I could offer for his tolerance of the whole situation. From the way his hands were wandering, I got the idea that he already had a reward in mind. Of course, his wandering hands led me to think of places to put my own hands. And then the special cell phone rang. We jumped apart as if we'd been hit by a jolt of electricity. My hands shook as I flipped it open and pressed the talk button.
"Don't worry, it's just me,"
said Detective Gonzalez.
"Everything in place?"
"Yeah, except my stomach." I willed it to stop doing flips and assured him that the first part of the plan had gone perfectly. We went over the instructions I was to give to String when he called. I'd even written them down in case I was too fuzzled to remember them exactly when the phone call came.
"Now we wait,"
Gonzalez said before he hung up. Yes, waiting was the only choice. Unfortunately, the romantic mood had vanished now that I had some time with nothing to do. Drake suggested a big room service breakfast, and I let him make the choices and place the call while I took a shower. Passing time before an unpleasant event has never been a strong suit of mine. I would always rather anticipate Christmas morning than a trip to the dentist, for instance. We'd agreed that we would both stay inside the room, mainly to avoid the complications that would happen if one of us were away when the call came. Drake still didn't want me taking the risk of running into String accidentally either. Another kidnapping was off our to-do list for a good long time now. Drake spent part of the morning on his own phone, touching base with clients and making plans for some upcoming jobs with the helicopter. I attempted to read a book, but actually read one sentence about 300 times before I finally gave up and began pacing the floor. It was nearly 4 o'clock when the special cell phone rang again. This time I recognized the number on the readout as Dave Gonzalez's.
"No word yet?" "We've had men watching the house in Bernalillo since last night. No sign of Stringer or Moeller all day."
Unfortunately, I couldn't give him any good news.
"Remember, when you hear from them, to allow at least an hour before the meeting. My men will try to track them, but it won't be a sure thing. We may not know how close they are at the time they call you."
I had just ended the call when a knock to our hotel room door sent the dog into a barking frenzy and my heart rate into the stratosphere. Drake pulled his pistol and approached the door quietly, checking through the peephole before relaxing and admitting Ron.
"Hey, I'm done with other stuff for the day. Any word?"
I filled him in on the late-breaking news. The next hour went by, as Elsa would say, slower than molasses in January. I alternated between wishing the crooks would just hurry up and call and hoping they'd forgotten all about the money. I didn't get lucky on either version of the wish. The red numerals on the clock had just clicked to 6 o'clock when the call came. The readout only said unknown. My voice seemed very tentative when I said hello.
"Hello, Charlie."
String's oily voice brought back all the horror.
"So, you did get the money for me."
I've got it right here. I eyed the large black duffel on the floor. It contained a layer of banded bills on top of a thick stack of blank paper. If it had all been the real thing, that would have provided another tempting reason for me to abandon this whole crazy scheme and take off for Barbados. But I wouldn't have done that. They have an extradition agreement.
Bring it to...
No, String. This time, I'm saying how it goes. You need this bag more than I need anything at all from you. Tough talk that I could not possibly enforce. He growled something about not being so sure about that. 7:30, the parking lot of the shopping center at Wantabo and Montgomery. I'll drive up in a silver pickup truck. I want to see both you and Mole.
I'm coming by myself.
This was the one contingency that none of us could guarantee, and Gonzalez had left it up to me to make a convincing argument why both men should be there. No way am I going to let him sneak up behind me while I'm talking face to face with you. You two drive up together, and I better not see a weapon on either of you. Once I see you both, I'll set the money bag on the ground, and then I get in my vehicle and leave. I clicked off the call before he had a chance to respond. It was chancy, I knew, but better than getting into a discussion and giving him the chance to make an alternate suggestion. This whole deal had to be on my terms. Chapter 41. I immediately called Gonzalez and let him know that we were leaving. Drake helped me get rigged up with the wire that Gonzalez had insisted I wear. He clipped the battery pack to the waistband of my shorts, ran the microphone wire under my cotton shirt, and handed me the receiver piece, which I plugged into my ear. At the time, I'd scoffed at the idea, but now I was glad for the contact. From our uptown hotel, I was less than 15 minutes to the drop site. If String and Mole were still down in the valley, anywhere near my office, they were at least 30 or 45 minutes away. If they'd somehow divined that they would be going to the far northeast heights, well, that might be a problem. They could get there ahead of me. At least they wouldn't get there ahead of the police. We put Freckles into her crate and stocked her up with a few treats, which she gobbled before I'd hardly closed the door. Drake would ride with Ron in his car, and I took the keys to Drake's pickup truck. They stayed a few car lengths behind me as we headed northeast through the city. I approached the chosen intersection and pulled in, taking in the neat tan stucco buildings with their green trim and awnings. Gonzalez had assured me that his people were in place, but I sure didn't spot them. The small center contained a number of neighborhood businesses, plus a good-sized bookstore. People were moving about, although I hoped that the fact that the meeting was taking place at the dinner hour would mean that the place wouldn't be crowded. If things got ugly... Well, it didn't bear thinking about at this point. We were committed. I pulled into a parking slot at the corner of the lot farthest from all the businesses. Ron found a spot about 3 rows away, facing his car toward me. Reassuring to see both of their faces watching me. Scary that I was about to be facing down the 2 men who'd killed 3 other people in their lust for this money. The sun was blasting in through the west-facing side of the truck, low in the sky. It would be down soon, and I hoped the whole business of catching the crooks would be over with before dark. I felt apprehensive, and yet buoyed at the prospect of an end to this whole thing. People came and went. Mothers with kids in their cars pulled into the drive-through lanes of a fast food place on the opposite corner. A white-haired man came out of the electronics store with a small bag in his hand. A man with longish hair, wearing shorts and a t-shirt, stood outside the bookstore, leaning on a post and reading a newspaper. He might be one of the cops. I tested my microphone by sending out a call for Dave Gonzalez. No response. That didn't help my jittery stomach at all. 10 minutes ticked by. The minuscule earpiece that Drake had hidden under my hair sizzled with static. Detective Gonzalez, are you there?
Roger that, Charlie. I'm at your 9 o'clock.
I glanced beyond my left shoulder and spotted him in a plain car. He didn't look my direction or acknowledge me.
Our men caught sight of them about a block away. They're driving a green Cadillac. Keep watching. Okay, there it is.
If I thought I had a nervous stomach before, now it did a few gymnastic moves.
Stay cool, Charlie. He's coming up on your 4 o'clock. He'll be...
His voice trailed off as the Cadillac came into my view. I reassured myself that my pistol was under the seat of the truck. Drake insisted that I have it with me. Gonzalez was equally adamant that I not carry it on my person. Spotting it would be the kind of thing that could set String off. If that were to happen anyway, my plan was to dash for the truck, get behind the door, and have a hand on my weapon. The green car slowly cruised up the aisle in front of the buildings. String and Mole were in the front seats, their heads turning, scanning for signs of trouble. They made a wide circle and came around to face me.
"Get out, Charlie. Set the bag down. You don't want them coming in close to your vehicle,"
Gonzalez said into my ear. Showtime. I grabbed the bag and lugged it across the seat as I stepped out. The green car was 100 yards away. I speed-walked to an open spot 20 yards from the truck, took a deep breath, and set down the bag. The green car moved forward slowly. I backed away, holding my arms out to my sides, palms up. In my ear, I could hear Gonzalez rapping out orders to his men, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. All at once, his voice came clearly into my ear again.
"Charlie, get back to your truck now!"
I quickened my pace, backing toward the truck, but keeping the green car in sight. String must have picked up on my nervousness. He gunned the car and came straight at me. Chapter 42. So much for taking cover behind the door of the truck. I immediately figured out that if the Cadillac hit the truck, I'd be squash. I sprinted for the edge of the parking lot, where curbing bordered a narrow band of landscaping. Somehow I hoped that the overgrown shrubs and the lone sycamore tree would protect me. String roared up beside the bag of money, and Mole opened his door and made a grab for the handles on the duffel. "They're taking the money!" I shouted to the world at large. Gonzalez and his team, however, had already spotted String's maneuver. The whole parking lot instantly went into motion. A brown van zipped to within inches of the passenger side of Drake's truck, forming an effective blockade to String's escape to the west. Gonzalez himself did a similar move on the east side. An APD cruiser roared in behind the caddy. Where had that come from? And a female officer dressed in casual summerwear emerged from a parked car, whipped out her service pistol, and screamed at the two crooks to freeze. Mole lost his grasp on the money bag. He tried to pull his door shut, but centrifugal force swung it even farther open. One of the officers had him out by the collar and face down on the pavement before he knew what hit him. String attempted to steer the car with one hand. The other came up with a pistol. Incongruously, I noticed that his hands were still bright pink from the bank die. Gonzalez had a two-handed grip on his own weapon, and it was trained firmly on String's face.
"Drop it!"
he screamed. The intensity of his expression left no doubt that he would fire first and answer questions later. Way to go, Dave. String let his pistol fall to the seat, and the caddy came to a slow rolling stop against the bumper of Dave's truck. I realized I was standing knee-deep in a massive clump of pampas grass, whose whip-like strands were trying to slice my bare legs to ribbons. My hands were over my mouth, and my eyes must have been about the size of dinner plates. Handcuffs snapped onto the two felons so quickly that I nearly missed it in a blink. The killers were lying face down on the ground, and the whole scene began to draw a little crowd. Dave Gonzalez picked up the duffel full of money and quickly locked it into the trunk of his vehicle before anyone could take advantage of it. String's baleful glare followed the movements of the bag. Then he turned that stare on me. Yikes. I really hope Gonzalez had been right about these guys getting maximum sentences. Chapter 43. That edgy feeling waxed and waned over the coming weeks as the whole bank robbery and kidnapping were relived in the media. Once they knew my real identity, the media swarmed me for a while. Well, okay, it was only about 2 days. Some ill-timed earthquake in Chile took away my steam pretty fast. I couldn't forget the hatred in String's eyes as the police pulled him up off the asphalt and shoved him into the back seat of a cruiser. It seemed that he'd fixed all the blame for his lost riches upon me. Because I wasn't really Christina Cross? Because I'd tricked him into that parking lot on that particular evening? I had no idea. When I saw the newspaper announcement of Billy's funeral, I called his mother. She was clearly in shock, with no understanding of how her son became involved. I couldn't offer any answers to that, but I did my best to let her know that he'd been pretty decent to me. Grabbing me in the bank and tying me up had clearly been done under String's orders, after all. By the time the call ended, neither of us really felt a lot better, but I'd done my best. I found myself being extra careful about locking doors and windows for weeks, until I realized that the trials would still be months away, and I wasn't doing myself any good by stressing over it constantly. Gradually, life at home and at the office had returned to normal. Ron and Victoria are looking pretty serious, and I keep speculating about whether there might be an autumn wedding in the family. She would be a fun sister-in-law, somebody who would get me out of the office once in a while. She might even instill some fashion sense into me. Our other new family member is fitting right in. Freckles has become quite the watchdog and very protective of me, and it's largely because of her that I've relaxed somewhat. Maybe that early imprinting, the day Drake found her during the time he'd been so worried for my safety, caused her to bond to me. Her unconditional love fills my heart, and I'm glad we share our lives with her. This concludes Stardom Can Be Murder by Connie Shelton. This novel is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. If you would like to receive our online newsletter listing new releases, simply go to booksinmotion.com and register with your email address. Newsletter members receive special discounts and freebies. No purchase necessary. That's one word, booksinmotion.com. From Books in Motion, this is Rebecca Cook. Thanks for listening.